You filled it last Sunday. Maybe you gave it a quick rinse or just a wipe with a damp cloth, then poured in the fresh seed and hung it back up on the hook by the window. By Monday morning, it was busy. Sparrows first, then finches, and a pair of chickadees working the edges. The feeder was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. You felt good about it, honestly. You're supposed to feel good about it. But here's what else was happening that Monday morning, totally invisible to you, right there on the surface of that feeder. Every single bird that landed was leaving something behind. I don't mean the mess, the scattered husks on the ground, or the little impressions in the seed. I mean something biological, invisible. And with every new visitor, with every beak dipping into that same narrow opening, pressing against those same plastic edges, that invisible stuff was building up. Not dramatically, and not in any way you could see, smell, or register. Just quietly, incrementally, in that slow way, all the most consequential things seemed to work. Your feeder had become a hub, and in biological systems, hubs are never neutral. We like this very clean, sweet story about bird feeders. We put them up because we want to help. The birds are beautiful, winter is hard, food is scarce, and if something genuinely kind about the impulse to hang a container of seed where a wild thing can reach it, that story is real and the impulse is totally legitimate. But that story skips something huge. It skips what happens when you concentrate a wild population animals that should be spread out across acres of territory, foraging in little scattered groups, into a single tiny point of contact, a place they return to, day after day, in numbers and at a proximity they would never naturally maintain. In the wild, birds rarely eat off the same surface as 50 other birds. They don't press their beaks into the same narrow port that dozens of strangers used an hour ago. They don't stand in a pile of old, wet seed debris while birds from 3 streets away land right beside them. These are things that only happen at your feeder, and the wrong one designed for looks instead of hygiene, with deep troughs that trap moisture, narrow ports that scrape beaks repeatedly, surfaces that you just can't get truly clean. That feeder turns a minor risk into something a lot more serious. Most people don't realize that the design of the feeder matters just as much as the food inside it. They focus on the seed, but they rarely think about drainage or material porosity, or the way a feeder's geometry actually forces birds into contact with residue they'd never encounter in nature. Here's what that contact actually produces. Salmonella is the big one most people have heard of. It spreads through bird populations when they poop on shared food surfaces, exactly the kind of condition a deep trough feeder with bad drainage creates. An infected bird visits your feeder, leaves contamination in the seed, and the next dozen birds that land carry it away to every other feeder in the neighborhood. This isn't just theory. Salmonella outbreaks linked to backyard feeders are documented all over North America, Europe, and Australia. They usually peak in winter when feeder traffic is high and we're all outside cleaning them less, but salmonella is just the visible end of a longer chain. Before there's an actual outbreak, there are weeks of what we call subclinical infection. Birds are carrying a bacterial load, but they aren't showing any symptoms yet. They spread it perfectly because they don't act sick. They look fine, they fly normally, and they visit your feeder, your neighbors, and the one at the park 2 streets over. The load just distributes. Now, a feeder doesn't cause this, but it definitely accelerates it. A feeder designed with good drainage, with surfaces that actually dry out, with ports that don't force constant beak contact with old residue, the feeder breaks the chain. The wrong feeder? It just keeps the conditions perfect for the chain to keep going. There's a second layer underneath all that bacteria, and it's actually a lot slower and more insidious. See, it doesn't always result in a visibly sick bird in your yard. Instead, it produces changed birds, behaviorally changed. And that shift is driven by something the wrong kind of feeder creates almost every time. Resource competition at a level their social systems just weren't built to handle. Think about a well-designed feeder. With enough access points and space, a natural hierarchy can actually work. Dominant birds eat, subordinates wait at a reasonable distance, and the whole thing stays quick and relatively low stress. But a bad feeder, with one single port, or a tiny platform with no room to move, you're forcing every bird into the same cramped space at once. The hierarchy just breaks down. It stops being social feeding and turns into a total scramble. Every bird is fighting to hold its ground against every other bird right there at the exact same spot. If you watch it, It just looks like activity. Birds coming and going, lots of movement. Honestly looks like success. But look at the body language, the wing flicks, the lunges, the way they shove each other out of the way. That tells a different story. Those birds are under constant, low-level stress. They aren't getting those little moments of rest they'd get while foraging in the wild. They're vigilant, they're reactive, and they're burning up energy on social management that should be going towards staying warm and keeping their immune system strong, especially when those systems are already being pushed to the limit. Winter is the time when birds really need to feed efficiently and rest. The wrong feeder in the middle of winter is just undermining those exact priorities, and you have to scale this up. Your feeder isn't an island. Birds don't really have territories. They have ranges. A single chickadee might hit 4 or 5 different feeders in a half-mile radius in one afternoon. A flock of house finches doesn't have a home feeder, they have a whole circuit. So whatever happens at your feeder doesn't just stay at your feeder. It spreads through the local population, kind of like how a gross water fountain spreads germs through an office building. It's invisible, it's constant, and it scales up based on how many birds pass through. If your feeder is a hotspot for disease, you aren't just putting the birds you see at risk. You're putting them at risk, and then they carry it to every other bird they meet. If you track how birds actually move, the impact of one dirty feeder can spread across an entire neighborhood's worth of birds in less than a week. See, epidemiologists have this term for it, the network hub effect. Essentially, high contact spots don't just affect the birds visiting them. They speed up how fast sickness spreads through the whole community. If your feeder is designed poorly or it's not being cleaned enough, it becomes a hub. And in the world of disease, those hubs are pretty much responsible for how outbreaks get out of control. The birds you're trying to help aren't isolated. They're part of a huge connected population. So, how you manage that one feeder? It has a ripple effect that goes way beyond what you can see from your kitchen window. But here's the thing that really changes how you look at it. The wrong feeder doesn't exactly have a warning label. It looks totally fine. It holds the seed, it brings in the birds, it does exactly what you expect a feeder to do. The real damage is slow, spread out, and pretty much invisible. No bird dies right there in your yard. There's no big, obvious outbreak. The population just gets a little weaker, a little more stressed, and a little more vulnerable, all across an area you'll never be able to see from where you're standing. And the whole time, the person who put that feeder up feels great about it. They fill it every Sunday, watch the chickadees and finches come and go, and take that activity as proof that everything is working. You know, the road to ecological damage is almost never paved with indifference. It's paved with good intentions and just not knowing the full story. The feeder is the kindness. The design is the problem. And that gap between what you meant to do and what's actually happening is where the harm lies, quietly, season after season. Think back to Monday morning. Those birds on the feeder, the seeds scattered on the ground, the good feeling of having done something nice for the wildlife in your yard. That feeling was real. The intention behind it was real. But now you know what else was real: the surfaces, the beak contact, the crowded social pressure, and the invisible spread of whatever each bird carried in and took away. None of that makes your generosity any less real. It just means you have more information now. And in this case, that information is exactly what turns a good intention into a genuinely good outcome. The feeder is worth having. It just has to be the right one. And honestly, it has to be clean. So, here's something to think about. If you got a feeder up right now, when was the last time you actually cleaned it? And I don't mean just a quick rinse. I mean fully disinfecting it, drying it out, and checking those ports for any gunk that's built up inside. Honestly, I bet that the answer to that tells you more about the health of the birds in your yard than anything else you're doing. Do me a favor and tell me in the comments, what kind of feeder are you using and how often are you actually scrubbing it down? I'm genuinely curious how many people have never been told that this part matters and what you're planning to do differently now that you know.